All right, well, thank you everyone for joining us for our second part of the Madame de Pompadour Salon series in preparation for our concert this Friday in the Salons of Versailles. And I would like to go ahead and introduce our artistic associate, Julia Doe, who is working with Opera Lafayette this year on many of our engagement series, as well as our program book we'll be having coming out in May. So I'll go ahead and turn this over to Julia.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thanks, Jace. And good evening, everybody. And so nice to see you all this evening, including many repeat customers from last week. If you were here last week, we got a general introduction to the life of Madame de Pompadour, to her patronage projects, and what it meant for a royal mistress rather than a royal queen, as we dealt with last year, to be a patron of the arts and a political power mover. And today we're dealing more specifically with Madame de Pompadour's musical patronage. And we're going to hear from an expert on this subject, a scholarly expert on this subject, as well as a musician who's helping to lead this concert starting on Friday and then repeated in New York City in May. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists for this evening. First of all, we have Callum Blackmore, who's a graduate student in historical musicology at Columbia University, where he's studying French opera in the long 18th century. His brilliant dissertation, I'm editorializing from what he's applied, Opera at the Dawn of Capitalism, Staging Economic Change in France and its Colonies from Remote Carabini, explores representations of economic life on the operatic stage in the lead up to the French and Haitian revolutions, including a really great chapter on Madame de Pompadour. Callum has been published in Current Musicology and Naxos Musicology International and has presented his research at the annual meeting of the American Musicological Society. This work has also been supported by a Barker Fellowship and fellowship from the Institute for Religion, Culture, and Public Life. Now, Callum will be in conversation this evening with the violinist Jacob Ashworth, who's interim artistic director and co-founder of Heartbeat Opera, artistic director and founder of Cantata Profana, as well as artistic associate and concertmaster of Opera Lafayette. Equally at home on modern and Baroque violin, as well as a conductor, Jacob has gained a reputation as a consummate curator of music, earning Cantata Profana the 2016 CMA ASCAP National Award for Adventurous Programming. He has performed extensively on period instruments with a long line of credits: Mark Morris Dance Group, American Bach Soloist, Tenet, and so on. And in contemporary music, he has premiered works with groups including New York New Music Ensemble, Princeton Sound Kitchen, the Mata Festival, and Philadelphia's Network for New Music. Jacob holds degrees and diplomas from the Yale School of Music, Indiana University, and the Manhattan School of Music. We're really excited to hear what he has to say about this program he's put together. So with that, I will end my prefatory remarks and I will hand off the microphone to Callum, who's going to give a brief presentation, and then we'll hear a dialogue between our two panelists.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen very quickly here. Oh, yes. Okay, fantastic. Here. Wonderful. So I thought I'd begin today by showing you a portrait. There are many wonderful portraits of Madame de Pompadour, but I'd like to begin by showing you my favorite one, this gorgeous full-length portrait by Maurice Quentin de la Tour. Now, I love this portrait for many reasons. The sumptuous autumnal brocade of the royal mistress's dress, the exquisite floral upholstery on her chaise, both of which symbolize the mistress's love for the rococo, the pastoral, and the luxury crafts. I also love this copy of Montesquieu's L'Esprit des Lois that sits on her bookshelf, and the illustrated plate from the Encyclopédie that dangles haphazardly from her desk, both symbolizing her commitment to the Enlightenment and all its intellectual products. But what I love most about this portrait is the manuscript that Madame de Pompadour holds in her hands. It's clearly a musical score. You can see the 5-line staves peppered with notes, and it functions as the centerpiece of de la Tour's portrait. The artist captures his sitter in the middle of turning the score's page. It's the only object in this fabulous room full of treasures that she actively engages with, and thus it appears somewhat animated or dynamic in de la Tour's painting. The music seems to literally come to life in her hands. So why would Madame de Pompadour choose to feature a musical manuscript out of all the wonderful things she has in this portrait as the centerpiece of the painting? And put simply, because music was at the center of Madame de Pompadour's time at court. Madame de Pompadour was born Jean-Antoinette Poisson and spent much of her early life being groomed for a position in high society. Her legal guardian, the tax farmer Charles-François Paul Lenormand de Tournem, ensured that the young Madame Poisson received an education worthy of any aristocrat. Her family and their friends were members of a wealthy, upwardly mobile bourgeois class. We've heard a lot of this last week with Christine, and I see she's here, but I'm going over some of this because it's very important to her kind of musical training. So they were financiers, bankers, and bureaucrats who recognized that instruction in the voice and the clavecin and the guitar would help to inculcate the young Madame Poisson into the highest echelons of French society. Madame Poisson's top-notch musical education not only endowed the budding socialite with a lifelong passion for music, but also provided her with a crucial social tool. She spent much of her early life observing the great saloniers of her day, hoping one day to achieve the same level of social and intellectual influence as these talented mondaines. She saw how these women wielded their musical abilities to enchant, to entertain, to influence, to network, and ultimately to enhance their social profile. Indeed, when Jean-Antoinette Poisson married the financier Charles-Guillaume Lenormand d'Étiole, she set up a private theatre, a so-called théâtre de société, in their salon, where she would perform small operatic entertainments for her esteemed guests. It was in this musical salon that the young social climber, now known as Madame d'Étiole, met many of the great thinkers of the Enlightenment, who she would later go on to patronize, Montesquieu, Crébillon fils, and her personal favorite, Voltaire. Madame de Pompadour's experience in the Parisian salons would prove particularly useful during her time at Versailles. Anyone who's read any memoirs or writings from the French Bourbon court knows that this could be an absolutely cutthroat place. And Madame de Pompadour, who was appointed as Louis XV's maîtresse en titre, or official mistress, in 1745, found herself at a distinct disadvantage. While the official mistresses of Louis XIV had all been of noble birth, Madame de Pompadour was from bourgeois stock. Worse still, she was connected by birth, by adoption, and by marriage to some of the most despised bourgeois financiers in the kingdom. And there was nothing that the aristocratic class at this time distrusted more than wealth that existed outside of the nobility. And so from the moment that Madame de Pompadour arrived at court, powerful members of the nobility began plotting her demise. Humiliating rumors swirled around her in the salons that she was diseased, that she was financially corrupt, and that she was prone to sexual perversion. And you can see some of these kind of nasty caricatures that people made about her at this time. And as part of this broader smear campaign, noblemen wrote derogatory songs about her, known as poissonnades, which were sung among the Parisian socialites to discredit her. And I have an example of one of these here, which explicitly addresses her musical activities and kind of circles them out for criticism. So I'll play that to you now.
La folle indécence de son opéra, séance, tout ministre va. Il faut qu'on y vante son chant fredonné, sa voix chevrotante, son jeu forcené.
Yeah, it's really nasty stuff, and it goes on for, I think, about 12 more verses after this. To make matters worse, Madame de Pompadour's position at court was a particularly precarious one. Her entire existence at Versailles as maîtresse en titre was reliant on retaining the favor of Louis XV. And the king could be a particularly tricky customer, easily bored and difficult to please. Louis XV was renowned for his morose, dispassionate manner. He resented his monarchical duties, preferring instead the rugged solitude of the hunt or the intimacy of the boudoir. Madame de Pompadour did her best to please this lugubrious ruler, but she found her duties as maîtresse en titre extraordinarily taxing. Between appeasing this fickle king and staving off the attacks of a hostile court, the favourite was kept constantly on her toes during her early years as mistress. Louis XV had an insatiable libido, which Madame de Pompadour struggled to satisfy. Bouts of whooping cough and tuberculosis had left her chronically disabled, and she found it increasingly difficult to fulfill her duties as the official mistress. She began to fear that the king would leave her for a younger, more virile woman, ejecting her from her courtly position in the process. In letters to friends, she complained constantly of pain, of exhaustion, of jealousy, depression, anxiety, and overwhelming feelings of inadequacy. It was a mistake coming to court, she wrote in 1747, just 2 years after arriving at Versailles. The life I lead is terrible, she would write in 1749. So thoroughly burnt out and fearing her ejection from Versailles, Madame de Pompadour hatched a plan to secure a long-term position at court. And music would play a really central role in this plan. She sought to create a platonic position for herself in the king's household by becoming indispensable to him as a confidant, as an advisor, an entertainer, and an administrator. She saw the king's incessant boredom and recognized that she need not necessarily have sex with the king to keep him satisfied. She simply had to keep him occupied long enough to stave off the tedium of royal life. Or, as Madame de Pompadour herself wrote, I saw that the king's great illness was the boredom which continually stalked him, and that consequently the surest means of fixing his heart would be that which would make him best pass the time. Much more than other men, kings, by the ease they have in procuring entertainment of all kinds, by the eagerness that pretty women put in giving themselves to them, are exposed to boredom and to satiation. The great art in a woman who wants to preserve the heart of her lover is therefore to moderate his pleasures. Since I arrived at court, the king was heard saying several times, "How time flies." So as she sought to transition from mistress to entertainer, Madame de Pompadour turned to the same kind of tricks that had worked so well in her husband's Parisian salon. She set up a private theatre in the king's personal apartments at Versailles, the Théâtre des Petits Cabinets, the theatre of the little rooms, where she would perform operatic entertainments for the king, and a small coterie of friends and nobles. The Théâtre des Petits Cabinets would usually perform on the winter evenings after the king had been hunting, with the entertainments terminating in a night of feasting and drinking. It was something of a hybrid troupe. Most of the singers were amateur aristocrats, usually impressionable nobles who Madame de Pompadour wanted to ally with by awarding them starring roles, while the dancers and the orchestra comprised a mix of talented aristocrats and professional performers borrowed from Paris's various public theatres. Madame de Pompadour herself not only served as the company's patron, but also its impresario and leading lady, managing the theatre and taking a central role in almost every opera the troupe performed. The Théâtre des from some of the most esteemed artists of the day, and the production values rivaled those of the Paris Opera. Madame de Pompadour called on many of her favorite artists to work on the scenography, including the royal engraver Charles-Nicolas Cochin and her preferred painter François Boucher. I was recently poking around in the archives of this theatre in Paris, and it gave me a wonderful sense of how expensive these spectacles were. In addition to spending 12,189 livres on costumery, which is about 1.6 million US dollars today, and she spent 14,531 livres on ribbons, lace, brocade, and other adornments, which is 1.9 million today. And finally, 3,597 livres on wig pomade alone, which is around 400,000 US dollars in today's money. Madame de Pompadour would also get in trouble for permanently borrowing props and costumes from the Paris Opera when they performed at Versailles. So this was a very, very glitzy operation. But Madame de Pompadour's real skill was in artistic collaboration, in bringing together a team of talented creatives to achieve her theatrical visions. Now, artists commissioned by the Théâtre des Petits Cabinets included Voltaire, Madame de Pompadour's old friend from the Parisian salons, who did kind of odd writing jobs for the company before the two had an icy falling out. Pierre Géliot, who was then the most famous tenor of his day and also Madame de Pompadour's singing teacher. But so as not to upstage his pupil, he played cello in the orchestra and tried his hand at composing for the troupe. François Augustin de Paradis de Moncrief, the Queen's private reader, who was scandalously commissioned to write libretti for the theatre, provoking the ire of Queen Marie Leczinska. François Rebel and François Francoeur, who were then the directors of the Paris Opera, and who also served as ad hoc musical directors to the Théâtre des Petits Cabinets. And you're going to hear some of their music actually in the upcoming In the Salons of Versailles concert. So listen out for that. It's truly wonderful. Jean-Joseph Castaner de Mondonville, who's also going to be appearing in this upcoming concert. He was the official composer for the King's Chapel and was really eager to break out as an opera composer. And he found the ideal venue in Madame de Pompadour's private theatre. Of course, Jean-Philippe Rameau, who was Madame de Pompadour's favorite composer and who was already something of a kind of unofficial court composer when he was called in to write for the troupe. And last but not least, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who maintained a really tempestuous relationship with the royal mistress when she gave the premiere of the full version of his Le Devin de Village in 1753. So with this great battery of artistic talent, Madame de Pompadour was able to formulate an operatic aesthetic that was perfectly tailored to entertaining Louis XV and his courtiers. Operas produced for the Théâtre des Petits Cabinets not only tended to find musical and dramatic ways of highlighting Madame de Pompadour's own vocal talents, they also often allegorized aspects of her relationship with the king. To demonstrate this, I'm going to take one short example, Rameau's Les Surprises de l'Amour, which was written for the Théâtre des Petits Cabinets in 1749. So in the first entree of this opera, Linus, the son of Apollo, is in love with the muse Yorani, who was played by Madame de Pompadour. However, despite secretly sharing Linus's affections, Yorani finds herself incapable of loving him back. So Linus, with the help of Cupid, tricks Yorani into picking up an enchanted lyre, which possesses her voice and body with the power of music. All of a sudden, Yorani, under the lyre's magical control, starts singing about the wonders of romance. Ultimately, through music's spell, Yorani is introduced to the marvels of love and is thereby unchained from her inhibitions, finally freed to love Linus, and thus they all live happily ever after. So this opera worked on a number of levels. On the one hand, the story of a woman who finds new ability to love through the power of music served as a metaphor for Madame de Pompadour's own sexual problems vis-à-vis the king, and allegorized the crucial role that music played in overcoming those issues. As Madame de Pompadour transitioned from royal mistress to unofficial advisor, she commissioned a work that dealt with the tensions of this transition, staging for the king's entertainment the various forms of non-sexual love that she was able to bring to their relationship. And on the other hand, the opera throws emphasis on Madame de Pompadour's vocal talents by providing plenty of opportunity for diegetic singing. When Yorani's voice is taken over by the enchanted lyre, it provided an opportunity for Madame de Pompadour to perform a series of tour de force love songs perfectly tailored to her voice, such as this one here. So if you're familiar with Rameau's music, you'll hear that this is a far cry from the grand, declamatory, dramatic style usually adopted by the composer. It's a lot simpler, a lot more melodic, a lot more repetitive. It's actually a kind of very short da capo aria. And it rarely calls for any extremes of vocal production. In other words, it was perfect for an amateur soprano like Madame de Pompadour, affording her plenty of scope to show off the beauty of her voice without ever causing her to overexert herself. And it was crucial that composers take care not to place too much stress on Madame de Pompadour's voice. Years of illness had rendered her voice extremely delicate. Even the smallest cold could leave her unable to perform, and she was known to start coughing up blood on stage during particularly difficult roles. As a result, Madame de Pompadour almost single-handedly championed a new, particularly singable operatic aesthetic, which came to take the rest of France by storm. And Madame de Pompadour's relationship with Rameau serves as the perfect example of how the royal mistress's private musical agenda came to influence public musical aesthetics in the 18th century. After a controversial rise to operatic fame, Rameau experienced his most successful years during Madame de Pompadour's first decade at court, soon emerging as one of the royal mistress's greatest musical assets. When discussing the endless task of cheering up the king, she would often say that Rameau was very useful to me in this respect. The king had a taste for light airs, and this musician excelled in this kind of composition. At Madame de Pompadour's request, the Paris Opera commissioned a series of works from Rameau, designed to cater to the royal mistress's aesthetic goals, most of which were premiered before the king, either at Versailles or at Fontainebleau. Indeed, Madame de Pompadour held such a strong influence at the Paris Opera, in part because she employed so many of its musicians on a part-time basis at her private theatre. This included, of course, its primo uomo, Pierre Geliot, and its two directors, Rebel and Francoeur. Madame de Pompadour's enemies resented her sway over the French cultural sector and sought out ways to curb it. The Marquis d'Argenson, who, as we heard last week, hated Madame de Pompadour and also hated Rameau in equal measure, eventually declared, "The Marquise de Pompadour, who is in charge of the entertainment, has just decided that we will only have Rameau's music at the opera for the next 2 years, notwithstanding the public's discontent with this. Goodbye to good taste, and to good French music." So when the Marquis d'Argenson's brother was given control of the opera in 1749, he immediately took measures to restrict performances of Rameau's work. Rameau responded in protest by temporarily withdrawing the opera that he was writing for the company. And actually, that opera was Zoroastre, which you'll hear an excerpt from it in the upcoming December 2nd concert. So listen out for that. It's a truly wonderful opera. So eager to support her favorite composer during this ugly dispute, Madame de Pompadour commissioned Rameau to compose Les Surprises de l'Amour for her private theatre to celebrate the signing of the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, which ended the War of the Austrian Succession, thus providing Rameau with employment and exposure even as his public career temporarily floundered. But not everyone at court resented Madame de Pompadour's patronage of the arts. A ticket to her private entertainments was one of the most coveted invitations at Versailles, precisely because the king was generally in such a good mood during these gatherings. An uncharacteristically good mood, I might add. Courtiers seeking favor with His Majesty would often have to beg and sponge to secure themselves a place at these performances. However, invitations were deliberately kept both limited and rather secret. Madame de Pompadour initially restricted the audience to just 14 people, but that soon swelled to over 100 as the demand for places grew. And she would use this demand to curry favor with an otherwise hostile nobility. For example, the Duc de Croy, a member of the king's hunting party, spent much of his time at court unsuccessfully sucking up to Madame de Pompadour in the hopes of securing a ticket to the Théâtre des Petits Cabinets. Upon being turned away from one of her private salons, he moaned, "I was all the more bitter about it, because there were not many people there that evening. I was foolish to be angry about it. I was not doing myself justice, because there is nothing that I am good at there. Nothing exists there but the theatre. There is not much time for us hunters." So Opera Lafayette's in the Salons of Versailles concert invites you to savor the aesthetic pleasures that even the Duc de Croy was not able to enjoy, by stepping into the kind of secretive, exclusive world of Madame de Pompadour's private entertainments. This concert features many of Madame de Pompadour's favorite composers, Rebel and Francoeur, Mondonville, and of course Rameau, and features the very music that Madame de Pompadour would have used to charm the sullen Louis XV. And to talk more about this program, we have with us today Jacob Ashworth, who's put together this wonderful concert. In fact, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so everyone can see him better. Jacob, oh yes, hi, there you are, Jacob. So I would love to talk a little more about the kind of thinking that went into the program, how you put this program together, and how it's structured. It's structured in 3 parts. Is that right?
That is right. And actually, just before you go into that, just to say that was a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much. That was wonderful to hear. and I also learned plenty from that. I had gotten to see Callum's slides before today, but with the script along with it, that was just terrific. So I'm still soaking all that in. So let me pull together sort of some of my things and be ready to answer your questions a little bit better. But I'm very excited to talk about this show that we have on Friday. So yes, the idea of the show in 3 parts. I'll say, first of all, you know, Ryan and Lafayette had approached me to curate this concert and to program, which is one of the things that I love doing most. I really love getting in there with repertoire and having a fun time programming concerts that sort of try to thread music together to tell a particular story, something that is larger than the sum of its parts. And in this, I was so excited to tackle the idea of salons, because salon music, and if any of you have been to a house concert or taken part in that, you know it's really the best way to experience music that there is. And actually, as a performer, I find it to be one of my favorite ways to perform music as well. I've always found that if you do anything particularly extraordinary in a house concert, the impact is like tenfold because everybody's so up close and it's so magical. And if you really mess up, nobody cares. So it's a perfect environment. And I think that was also true for a lot of composers. And I think that was why a lot of composers were able to try something new in their chamber music and bring something in. And then it becomes true for the folks that are curating and programming whatever's coming up at their house. They can say, here, try this dish along with all these other ones. And we might be able to bring something in that's a little harder to introduce in the full theater with all of the weight of that. So I did structure this show in three parts, and really the first part of it, to me, it's both a salon that Madame de Pompadour would have thrown, but it's also something of her own character. And I sort of imagine her at the beginning of this show being, it's almost like the moment before everybody arrives, and it's her in her own world and sort of thinking about this music. So it's kind of her in her chambers, a sort of private pre-salon moment that's all French music, and it's really the composers that she loves. So as we heard about, we start with Mondonville, which is this incredible couple of pieces that maybe we'll talk more about later. And then we have this excerpt of an opera by Francoeur, and then we have a big Rameau chamber music piece, from one of his sets that are just a really incredible example of chamber music from that period, and really him at some of his most deft. And then we have the second set, which takes place in the salon of a different Madame of the court, Madame Joseph de Saxe, who came from Dresden. And I had a lot of help coming up with this from Nizam, who I see is here, who helped come up with some of the composers that were from Dresden that were being introduced. So you have people coming from different geographical locations. They want to bring a little bit of their music to the court. So the second set is sort of structured as a bit of a Frankenstein sonata. So it has a first movement, which is Mozart. It has an aria, which is really the form of a full cantata by Johann Adolf Hasse, and then a third and fourth movement, which go back to France with Leclerc. And then the third set is sort of like, okay, now maybe we're in the theater. We're in that petit cabinet. It's a grander salon. So we have slightly bigger forces, a little bit more opera scenes in there. And it's kind of more cosmopolitan because you bring in that Italian and the French, and there's no German music in the third set, but I find a little bit of the influence there, especially in the Rameau and these composers that were able to synthesize so much more. So those are our 3 sets for the evening.
Oh, it's going to be such a wonderful program of music. it's so interesting hearing you talk about the kind of intimacy of these salons and the effect of hearing these pieces kind of up close and personal. But I'm also really interested that a lot of these pieces were not originally written for kind of salon forces. You know, you have operatic excerpts, you have some sacred music in there as well. And I would love to know a bit more about what it's like kind of re-rendering these for in a kind of salon context, turning them into chamber music. How does that feel as a performer, and how do you think audiences are going to experience that?
Absolutely. I mean, it's sort of a modern intrusion in a way. So, you know, when I hear you talk about Madame de Pompadour and her, I had to ask you before I answer this, the pomade that's $400,000, is that per season or for a show?
Oh, that's for the whole season. That's not
Wait,
one.
still.
And it's for all the wigs, not just her wig.
Oh yeah, right. No, I know, but I just absolutely love that fact. That's one of my favorite things I've learned this week. I don't think at the time this was necessarily happening so much in the grand salons. I feel like somebody like Madame de Pompadour, if she was going to do an excerpt from an opera, she would probably have the whole orchestra there, and she would do that. She would bring something else into her salons. But whether at this time or maybe a little bit later, could be a little anachronistic. A lot of these tunes that were done in the operas, you know, eventually they become the pop songs of the day. They become the popular music, and they get filtered down through the living rooms of the aristocracy and then the bourgeoisie, and everybody starts sort of glomming onto these pieces and performing them in whatever context they can get their hands on. So there's something very liberating about the slightly more private atmosphere of the salon, where you get to say, oh, I love that aria. Can you do that? Oh no, it takes 5 violins and 2 cellos. Well, but can you still sort of do it? Yes, absolutely. And maybe it's even more fun to see it with only 2 performers or 3 performers, and it takes on a different meaning.
I'd like to interject that, Jacob, you're the man for this kind of thing, because I don't know that everyone on our audience knows that with Heartbeat Opera, the company you helped found, that one of the things you do on a regular basis is to take these larger works and make them chamber-sized, and make dramatic works chamber-sized. And I was struck when we were talking about the Rameau and how you would present the pièce de clavecin, that, you know, I showed you that quote of Rameau's biographer talking about it being the age of arrangements, and you decided to take the 2 violin version that you're doing and arrange it a little yourself. And I think it's interesting to me, and it might be to our audience too, that you this is something you haven't been shy about, and you have a lot of experience doing. And it's with much bigger pieces, with whole operas, as a matter of fact. And I'll let you continue, but I thought that was I think that's something that's been fun for me to watch.
Thank you, Ryan. That's great. I do. It's funny. I come to this very much as a purist once upon a time, but I've really left that behind. And actually, what Ryan's referring to is kind of a great way that we do have this liberty to do this. The Rameau piece that you're going to see in the first half that I described as this wonderful chamber music piece, it's from his pièce de clavecin en concert. And like many pieces written at that time, there will be a title page that just indicates a potential completely other orchestration for the piece, without then otherwise ever talking about it. So it's very much this piece that is written for violin, gamba, and harpsichord. And then he says on the front page, you know, or flute, or a second violin. And he leaves it at that. He never says anything else about it. And there's no parts from the time that are a violin part. There's nothing to do with. So we took him at his word. And sometimes you wonder if a composer just said, well, if I write that on the title page, people will sell more copies because more people will buy it. Or I really think this is going to be a good example. And this continues into modern day, one of my favorite modern examples of that is that, you know, there's nowhere in Das Lied von der Erde, the big Mahler symphony, where it says you can sing this with an alto and with a tenor and a baritone, except on the title page, and then never prints it ever again. But just on the title page, there's a little asterisk and says, or baritone. And so now you have Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau singing Mahler's, you know, Das Lied. So sometimes we still do this all the way up until today. But I think answering your question a little bit more, Callum, I would say arranging these things, especially the opera numbers, and bringing them in, turning an opera aria into an art song, essentially, by putting it in the salon, is a really wonderful thing to do. And it sort of goes back to this very basic thing that most of the pieces that we play, it's either a song or a dance. That's really 99% of what we're doing. And so it sort of embraces that and says, here's a different way we can present it.
Oh yeah, I love that phrase, the age of arrangements. Yeah, I think it's so right. There was this huge kind of commercial explosion for arranged music. I mean, you had composers who just made their livings essentially arranging stuff for these salons. And I think you've really pointed to this really interesting connection between the rise of the salons and the rise of this commercial music publishing movement, which Julia has been writing a little bit about as well. So she knows a lot about this stuff. And yeah, oh, it's so wonderful. And I'm really looking forward to hearing them in this new setting. Just kind of circling back, you were talking a little bit about these different kind of national styles that we're going to hear in this program. And of course, this was the Enlightenment, the kind of growing age of cosmopolitanism. And so I'm really interested in how you see these different styles interacting in this program, and what audiences should listen out for. I mean, you know, how can we tell the difference between an Italian piece of this time, a German piece of this time, and of course the French pieces of this time that Madame de Pompadour loved so much?
Absolutely, it's a great question. I'll just say I have always a little hiccup whenever I think about, you know, telling an audience what they should or should not or should hear or something like that. Any sort of prescriptive measure, I get a little allergic to that. But I think a lot of this audience might be familiar with some of these things. And, you know, there's a very basic, you know, if you go to a Baroque Music 101 class, they'll tell you that the Italians are full of flair and running notes and all kinds of fireworks, and the French are it's perfume and it's just subtlety and it's all of this. And so, yes, that's essentially true in a lot of the ways, but actually I like that kind of turning that on its head a little bit in this program. And partly because you have somebody like Rameau who takes in every style and does everything. So the French music does dominate the program. And I think that after this first set in Madame de Pompadour's living room, when we go to the second set and we hear the very young Mozart. So on this program, there is one of, I think it's rare when you have a good reason to program one of the things that Mozart wrote when he was 6 years old. But this is a first movement of a sonata of his. And when I listen to it, or I think about it, I sort of feel the whiplash of that German style hitting. And then that set, though, ends with a two-violin sonata by Jean-Marie Leclerc, who was an incredible French violinist. And I sort of feel like he had gone so far out of what we think of that more, subtle French style into something much more what we later think of as instrumental in German. And I hear the Mozart, and I hear the 6-year-old Mozart thinking that's really what he was dreaming he could write. That's what he really wished he could do, was write that Leclerc music. And so then the last set, we bring in the Italian music, which is great because we're going to get to hear Pergolesi later in the year. So we get to meet Pergolesi. And he tosses this totally on its head because this is not the flary Italian version. This is the most beautiful Italian music. It's actually all quite languorous and slow and spacious, and it has this sort of atmospheric quality, which I think is what makes Pergolesi so timeless and really still speak to us, is he was just able to paint with these very impressionistic sort of colors that are so incredible. So like the salons of the time, it really all gets mixed together. And then I think that Rameau does something that, we think of a lot of the tippy top composers that we have, the Handels and Bach and Rameau, and eventually Mozart. What they were able to do was they were able to be the cosmopolitan composer who combined every country around and took the best of everything that was there. And so Rameau is absolutely eating up these German and Italian influences and able to make them come out in his music in a way that is distinctly French and yet somehow so much more complicated and virtuosic than a lot of what was before. And then you have someone like Mozart, who I think something you could sort of hear in this, if you hear the early Mozart that's in this program, and then think about the idea that Mozart's education was being brought all over Europe to all these salons. And the way he experienced all this music and learned all these other styles was exactly at concerts like you're going to see on Friday. So this way of bringing everything into the chamber and saying we can mix it all together here and show you a bit of everything is actually what then prompts the next generation to be able to write in a very different style and combine everything.
Oh yeah, I think this concert is really capturing this very interesting moment in the history of European music, where you start to get these really interesting mixes and crossovers between styles.
I was struck, Callum, when you said that. I thought you said something about, when Madame de Pompadour needed to have things written very simply and affected Rameau's style that way. It usually, when we're thinking of the simplification of styles in France, we're not thinking of it from the top down. We're usually thinking it from the bottom up, with the Italians who are coming into and then influencing the opera comique at the fairs and that sort of thing. So that was new to me. Of course, and I've done a lot of those pieces that. Or a lot of those operas where they're allegorical stories that tell Madame de Pompadour being the female on some level and the male character being and all of them. The male character has all the virtuoso stuff, but it's true that the female always has a simpler vocal line, and I think the male was often Géliot, who was you said playing cello sometimes in the orchestra, which was new to me as well. So that was fun to hear.
Okay, publicly, she was, very nationalistic about music. She was kind of seen as the figurehead for the French musical style at the time. But privately, she was a very, I think, very interested in these different, kind of more simpler styles. I didn't go into this, but she also commissioned people like Favart, who you've done a number of Opera Lafayette has done a number of operas with Favart librettos. She was a patron also in a much smaller way of this kind of fairground music and this new Italian style. So I think it's so wonderful that we're getting that represented here on this program. Actually, we're seeing the two sides of this really interesting historical figure. I was wondering if we could pivot very quickly to talk a bit more about the performers themselves, because you've lined up an absolute tour de force ensemble, and I'd love to know how you brought these people together.
Oh, absolutely. No, it's a great group. So it's 6 performers total. So one of them is Justin Taylor, who Ryan has brought in for a lot of this season, and he's this incredible hotshot harpsichordist from France, and I met Ryan last spring when we were doing Sylvain, and I had gone out to New Mexico and was working on Sylvain with Ryan and the whole company. And then when we came back and performed it in DC and then in New York,
Justin then.
And exactly, and met Justin there, and so I'm very happy to be working with him again. He's really seems absolutely wonderful. And then Emmanuel, the singer, is somebody who actually I first was introduced to by Ryan a number of years ago. If many of you were there a few years ago when we did La Susanna was a co-production between Opera Lafayette and Heartbeat Opera, which is the company I helped start in New York and that I run now. And Ryan and I were co-music directing that, playing our fiddles next to each other, and we had cast the show together, and Emma was one of the people we were potentially looking at for the lead role. So I was really excited about her when I first heard about her, and so I'm particularly happy that a few years later I finally get to meet her and play with her. She'll be, I think her flight has already landed and she's here.
Yes, it was and people at last time, it was Hurricane Sandy when she was here. And so people who came to the Kennedy Center concert were drenched, and people who came to the New York concert had to move it from Carnegie Hall. They had that dangling crane over, and so nobody could be on 57th Street, so we had to move it to a private club. So I think she'll be here. I think she'll be here under less stressful circumstances this time.
That's great. And then for some of the other players that are playing with us, I'm very excited that Jun Huang, who I've sat next to, she's been my associate concertmaster for many shows with Opera Lafayette, and she's an incredible stand partner, but now we get to really come up together as soloists. So I was really happy to get to invite her to be part of this. Isaiah Chapman was a violist who I first met actually at the Smithsonian a few years ago, doing an incredible project that we did there, where we got to play all of their Strads and Amadis and original instruments, and actually have them set up with gut strings and have an incredible Haydn quartet symposium. That's when I met Isaiah. And then I'm really excited about Serafim Smigelski, who's this incredible cellist that actually lives a block away from me here in Brooklyn. And I've known him for a few years. He was actually a member of the Tesla Quartet, and so he can spit out tons of new music on his cello. He's a wonderful Baroque player and just terrifically energetic guy. And he's going to be joining us for, I believe, all three projects this year.
Yes, I'm afraid our Loretta has a thing in May that she's been doing for years that makes her unavailable. But the side nice thing about the terrible loss of Loretta is that we get to hear Seraphim, and I wonder, is his quartet, do they still call themselves a Tesla String Quartet?
They I believe do, but I think he took off.
Better than FTX String Quartet.
Yeah.
This will be Seraphim's debut with Opera Lafayette, won't it?
That's correct. I'm very excited about that. So yeah, it's a dream band, and we have such great music to play, so it should be really exciting.
I'd love. I see we're at 10:02, so maybe we should open up. If anyone has any questions for Jacob about this program or anything that they'd like to ask, I'd love to hear from you.
Jacob, I'd like to know, when you're putting together a program like this, how long does it take you, given all the options, all the musical options that are out there, and what is your process for narrowing that down?
I would say it's like a lot of things where sometimes a good 50 or 60% of the show comes together in a few minutes, and then the other 40% of the show can take sometimes even the better part of a year. It really, so that's often when I'm putting together a program like that, if I can string together 2 or 3 or 4 things that make sense and have a story that I'm really excited about, then I know we're on the way to something, and it's just about finding the other pieces that go into it. And sometimes you can have real shocks where it turns out most of those things you started with actually end up out the window and you go a different direction. Sometimes it's very surprising to think about which piece on a particular program ended up being sort of the linchpin that made all of it want to happen. So I frequently program a lot of things with my other ensemble cantata profana, where you might have 15 different pieces in a program, and it turns out it's just one, folk song I heard once is really the kernel of all of it, and that's what it's hinging on. And sometimes it is the really big piece that ends something. But I love doing a program like this where there's no single piece that takes over all the rest. There's not one huge thing at the end. It's really just a beautiful series through. And then there's certain ideas that start forming things into little pockets. So this idea of the second set being kind of a sonata unto itself, especially during this time when that sonata form is that we typically think of a first movement, a song, a dance, a fourth movement, is relatively new at this time. And so that's also a fun reflection of the moment. But I think this program, if I'm casting my mind back, I really do think that the idea, there was an early idea that we would only have one singer and that she sort of would be Madame de Pompadour. It's a very hazy idea that came early on, and that was kind of where that first set came from. And this idea that this music is sort of, it's what she presents, but it's also really integrally who she is, and that in the position that she's in, and with the restrictions that are around anybody in court and the sort of place that each person has and the role everybody has to play, that she had this opportunity for a form of expression that I think was really not available to 99% of the people in any court environment. I think there's not really a lot of room for that, and whether you're a hunter or a musician. And so she has this vehicle, this voice, as a curator, as a programmer of music, which is very close to my heart. And so I do love that sort of personal touch. But otherwise, it's a big unanswerable question, but I hope that gives a little taste.
Thanks for trying to answer it. It sounds to me in some ways much the same as I plan vacations, in that you start with one thing and then add others and then throw things out as you go, just trying to piece together things that fit your vision.
Yeah.
We have a wonderful anecdote from Judith in the comments, which so Martini was hanging out in the do you want to talk a little bit more about that, Judith?
Yeah, Jim, sorry, I'm sitting here in semi-dark, but that's where Martini went. A number of people from Paris headed down to Lyon and were hiding out there during some upheaval in the revolution. It was called federalism, but you don't need to worry about that. But yeah, I believe that I'm struggling to remember the full story now, but I think Lenormand d'Étiole, after Pompadour's death, I think he remarried someone from theater or opera, and if there's a connection there, and then they had gone down to Lyon. Yeah. So I bet when you were talking about him, I read, oh yeah, that's where Martini was hanging out during the revolution, hiding out, and doesn't come back to Paris until after Thermidor, until after Robespierre's dead.
It's such a fantastic, fantastic anecdote. Thank you. Do we have any more questions here? Oh yes, John. Hi.
Judy. So, I may have missed this, but at the end of her life, as she was dying, she hosted the Mozart family in the Élysée, I think at least once, and then again in Versailles the following year, 64. First one was December 63. Do we have any indication that she may have felt that this family was a cut above some of these other musicians that you've run through that didn't rock the boat so much? Or, I mean, I've never seen anything of her reaction to that music. I think there were 4 early sonatas in play with the sister on the harpsichord, and Mozart, the 8-year-old or almost 8-year-old, on the clavichord, and then the father bearing over them behind with the violin.
It's interesting. There's an account from the music director of the King's Chapel from this time of the 1763 visit, where he says that Madame de Pompadour was perfectly polite and sat and listened to the music and gave compliments afterwards. But the person who was really, really enthused by it was Marie-Joseph de Saxe, who is, of course, kind of making up this middle portion of Jacob's program here. And she grew up in Saxony and was married into the Bourbon court through an arranged marriage, and essentially spent most of her life missing the wonderful Austro-German music that from her childhood, and also the Italian music. There was so much Italian music in Germany at that time in a way that it hadn't quite broken through in the same way in France, and so she was so happy by this account to see hear this German music, hear this wonderful young Austrian composer and his family perform. That's the little anecdote I have. So she was apparently hugging and kissing the little young Mozart, according to this one account. But yeah, I think by that time Madame de Pompadour was a little more demure. She kind of has this religious turn later in life, and turns away a little bit from the kind of musical activities that she was really into when she was young. But this younger member of the court was just so excited by hearing this child prodigy. Yeah, that's a fantastic question.
Although it sounds like, though, that we don't know that she was recognizing incredible talent as much as she was recognizing a style that was something that she was missing, or right? And it's so interesting. You never know how much is a matter of taste too. The later Mozart, of course, becomes very popular in France, whereas Beethoven doesn't, and isn't until takes a long time into the 19th century before the French really start listening and performing Beethoven. So it's how much is taste and style and how we can tell whether anybody recognized that Mozart was or was the person he would become. It's a great question. Christine.
Yeah, thank you this has been such a fabulous talk. Thank you so much for putting it together. But something I always wonder about with music from the 18th century or times past is, what it really sounded like. What are we recreating? How close can we get to what it really sounded like? And I was also wondering if we have any specifics about what Madame de Pompadour's voice was actually like. You hear that she had a lovely voice, that she had a soprano, but are there? I haven't read so much about her musical, the specifics of her musical performances, but I wonder, do we have accounts that give us any sense of what that would have been like, what she was like as a performer too?
Oh yeah, well I'm sure you've read the same kind of sets of court memoirs as I have, and I mean I mean, you find in these memoirs these really kind of dramatically differing accounts of her voice. If people liked her, her voice was lovely. I think they kind of praised it all over the place. But if people hated her, I mean, we saw in that Poissonnade, goat-like voice, this kind of shrill, horrible voice. I always go to the memoirs of the Duc de Luynes, because I feel like he has he's a bit more measured in the way he talks about Madame de Pompadour, and particularly he kind of gives specific accounts of what her voice sounded like. That it was kind of thin and not particularly loud, but she had this, and she was trained from a young age to be a musician, and so she had apparently this wonderful musicality, even if she didn't have the same kind of projecting power that a lot of people had. But what we have, I think the best primary source we have are these operas, is the scores for these operas, some of which, especially the ones by Rebelle and Francoeur, often have little notations in her part, little kind of notes for her, which might show us where she was having difficulty, or what things she struggled with, what things she did well, which I think is so fascinating. I mean, that's part of what's enticing to me about this, and actually about this concert. And maybe Jacob, as someone who's done a fair amount of period performance, or Ryan, can talk about, what it's like to try and recreate this, this style where we have no recordings, we only have these kind of fragmented sources. Do either of you?
One of the interesting things I think in casting sometimes is, you try to trust a singer, and you have a singer look at the role, and occasionally you'll find singers who will look at a role that a particular 18th century singer did, and look at lots of roles that singer did, and they'll say everything that she did fits my voice, and and I can do what that singer did, but I can't do what other singers did. And I sometimes I think, whether it doesn't exactly tell you the quality of the voice, but it certainly tells you what kind of singer she was. So finding, if we can find a soprano today who looks at all the roles that Madame de Pompadour sang and says, "Oh yeah, that fits me," and then we'll get as close as we can, probably. So
I think it sounds like we're all sort of in agreement about this idea, as you said, Callum, of the best source material being some form of either the music or the equipment or the instruments, rather than the words written about the music. The words written about the music are most difficult to actually apply to sound. And so similarly to that way with the scores, with string players and anything like that, you can read a million treatises and that's great, but also if you hold a Baroque bow for long enough, it will tell you what it wants to do. If you play on a gut string for long enough, it will tell you what it does and does not want to do. And that's sort of your best guide all the time. But also the thing I think everybody will always acknowledge is the one thing we can never return to is the ears of the original audience. And we're never gonna get back to a time when no one's ever heard an aircraft overhead, or no one's ever heard something at I don't know what a large number of decibels is, but too many decibels, and so a Baroque trumpet would really be one of the loudest things you've heard in your whole life. And similarly, people's reactions to somebody's voice, to the way this music was done, is all going to be colored by who they were, and that part is for us to reinvent, but hopefully very joyfully reinvent and find sort of a new love for it. I think JC was about to cut us off. Maybe
I was just going to say, I did notice we are past time, so I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us this evening. But feel free to stay on if you have any more questions, or if you want to hear some more from our two panelists. But thank you again for joining us this evening, and we hope to see you on Friday.
Thank you, Jace. Thank you, Julia and Callum and Jacob.
I know it was fascinating. I loved all of it.
I don't know if I told people that it was during COVID that Jacob put on a recital with a keyboard player, and at least that was when I listened to that French recital that you did, and I really said, oh yeah, he really loves this style too. I'd heard you in other things, but I hadn't heard you in that music, and I remember particularly actually the Monde en Vieux Le Bénéfac that you're going to do on this program, which I think is I remembered as such a lovely piece, and it's actually kind of a seasonal reverent piece as well.
True.
And I'm looking forward to hearing that as well as the dramatic stuff.
That piece is really extraordinary. So we're starting the concert with that, and it sort of feels like one of those pieces that's kind of almost a genre unto itself. There's very few examples of this, and even the score is really crazy to look at, because he says these are he calls them sonatas, but the text is all sacred text. It's all in Latin, and it'll just be a phrase. So there's one song that's just Benefac Domini. I can't remember my Latin, but only 3 more words. And it's
and doubling, so much doubling with the voice and the violin, but
voice. It's sort of like and or violin. Another one of those where he says you can kind of do whatever you want with it. But so if you do it with voice and violin, you have to make some choices, because I don't think he meant for the two to be in unison for an entire piece. So you have to sort of make choices about when you're coming in and how to orchestrate it. And the harpsichord right hand is also in unison very much. And so they're very delicate, very particular pieces. And then some of the rest in the set, I'd love to do the whole set one day. It's just incredible. Some of them are very virtuosic and in strange ways. And then the other one that we're doing just has this stormy harpsichord part for the whole thing. Just arpeggios on the harpsichord for the entire piece. That's, so much of what it is. And a big dramatic moment that seems like it's from a whole other collection. So I love those, yeah. And Frank Kerr, who's also on the program, is very close to my heart as well, and probably Ryan's as a fellow violinist, basically running an opera company, which he was.
We did. I think people know that in 2007 we did Rebelle and Frank Kerr's Zélander Roi des Sous, which was exactly something that Madame de Pompadour did, and it's about this king of the silk who first is invisible, and then and he's flying around, and he's saying he's in love with this mortal woman, and of course that's King Louis and Madame de Pompadour, and then when he finally appears to her, it's this magical moment, and then of course the idea that you could meld these two worlds is a metaphor for her trying to make it at court. And there was and as you say, that great violin writing, and also the idea that two people wrote an opera together, and you don't know who wrote what music, that they didn't care about that kind of saying that kind of pride of authorship, that they worked so closely together for so many years, that that was one of the first time I encountered the idea that of something coming from the studio or coming from the pen of two people, and that's a thing unto itself. It seems to me. I'd be curious about knowing about other examples of that, but it seems pretty unusual, and I don't know what kind of relationship they had, but it was clearly one that worked for a long time. And
yes, you think to be in business with each other and also to be writing operas together, they must have got along really, really well.
Right.
So imagine it's just stressful running the
an opera company. Oh, let's not go there.
Yeah.
Jacob and I could talk about that for a while too. But
Yeah.
Yeah.
Don't take financial management decisions from the Paris Bureau. It's not a good idea.
Yeah, watch that. Cut down on that pomade. Well, that's it. Yeah, it's been really interesting on a lot of levels for us, I think. Joan, do you have any questions you want to ask? I see you there. No. John, where are you from? You're unmuted now. You're still muted.
Born in Washington, D.C., but I'm a northerner. Grew up formative years in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
And where are you now?
I'm in Washington, D.C. I'm a retired Foreign Service officer. When I was in college, I majored in French history. People said, what are you going to do with that? I said, who cares? The day I graduate, I get sent to Vietnam. I finessed that because of some Quaker antecedents, and but somewhere along the line, I had proudly flunked French because it's very cool when I was a kid in Pittsburgh to do really badly in French. French was sort of for girls, so I was taken off my little league baseball team and sent to France for the summer. I was 13 and did cold turkey French. So. With the French, after alternative service, I decided to see how the other half lived, and was getting a doctorate in anthropology and got a grant in West Africa. You can get around France in English these days, but not in West Africa. I never heard of it. And so my entire career in the foreign aid business was in Francophone West Africa mostly. Still is. I'm long retired, but I'm still in the reforestation business. I just got back from Egypt, which is hopefully my last conference of the parties. When I was still in the government, I was on the delegation at the end of the last century. And I know the texts and the subtext there for what that's worth. But you know, that speaking of subtext and political current things, although I'd love to talk reforestation with you sometime, but I don't think everybody else is so interested in that. When Macron coming this weekend, I was thinking, you know, of course, I've been in touch with the French embassy, and I was thinking, well, you know, it's too, Macron doesn't want it. He's already associated too closely with Versailles, and people think of him as too elite. And so it's perfect that Jean-Baptiste is playing for the White House State Dinner and on this Friday, and that he's going to get to dance with the American people. So it's a big week for France in Washington, that's for sure. Well, you know, the Great Green Wall down in the former Francophone, or the former French colonies, the Francophone ones, France has really been drummed out of a number of them, just, you know, more definitively than ever. And we'll see if that gets more or less trees planted. But basically, the trees aren't planted because women aren't allowed to own agricultural land in most of those countries, and the World Bank never has the nerve to push back on that. So you plant trees, make your land look green and nice, you lose it to the kleptocratic post-colonial governments. Maybe that'll change.
Well, you know, we actually did, to bring that back to music, we actually did a piece called Le Roi et le Fermier, and there was occasion to talk about trees in that opera. We took it to Versailles, and I remember at the same time I was reading about the opening of the Forest Service here with the guy who Gilbert Pinchot, who was a friend of Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt's, and who has his name on the Yale Forestry School. But he was talking about having gone like you to France as a young child, and and being so impressed with the rows of trees in France, you know, where everything was planted and orderly, and as opposed to the, but became, as a result of that, he said, oh, well, here in the United States, we have, you know, we have wilderness and we have to protect this wilderness and all that stuff. And so we got the Forest Service and a whole different attitude towards trees and horticulture, which there was, you know, coming out of our opera, Le Roi de Fermier, and this, when this forester woodsman meets the king and talks to him.
I did my doctorate up there in a joint program with anthropology and the forestry school up there at Yale. Yeah. And yes, Yale forestry is unusual, which, you know, they've overreached with one company, Indigo Ag, which really didn't figure out how greenhouse gases move in and out of the soil, which is where the real money is, down below. But it very much is a function of which trees you're planting with which other trees in it, as a relationship with the soil. It's musical almost. The way.
Well, who else is on it? Ellen and Parker, and I don't know. I know Aya because we're looking forward to working with her on in January, and she's got a great picture of her next to a harpsichord there. And Martin Picard, I don't know you, but I'm glad you're here. And I guess when do we reconvene, Jace? You want to tell people about the next one in January?
Yeah, so our next session is our next salon series will be in January. We're looking at I believe the 15th and the 25th, maybe. I have to relook on my dates, but that announcement should be coming out later this month. That one's actually going to feature Julia Doe as one of our main speakers for the first session. And we're going to be discussing kind of Pergolesi and preparing for that concert on February 2nd. And that one, the second session, we actually will have a few of the artists join us as well. I believe Jonathan Woody and Patrick Quigley, who are working on that production.
Yeah. Great.
Yeah.
Jacob, do you have any parting words for us?
Well, I hope I'll see some of you on Friday. And this has been really wonderful. Thanks, Callum, for teaching all of us and including me a lot about a lot of this. And it's great. Thank you to Opera Lafayette for giving me the chance to put together this program.
So
Thanks so much, everybody.
Yes,
Yeah, what a great
everyone.
program.
We look forward to seeing you on Friday.
Okay.
Night, everybody.
Bye.
Everyone, bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.